everybody, and welcome along to the history programme with me, Tony Brown and Tom Donovan from the Limerick Historical Society. And today we are with Brian O'Donnell. Do you go by Brian or Brian?
Brian O'Donnell.
I would say Brian, yeah. Anyway, but Brian O'Donnell, Brian, a native of Ennis, but now domiciled in Dublin. Am I right?
That is correct.
Anyway, and I should tell people out there as well that you're the current editor of the Other Clare. I said the Old Clare, the Other Clare. I'm thinking of the Old Limerick Journal in my head. Just I tell you, I'm gone up a step now today. I have two editors with me. I'm the editor of the Other Clare and the editor of the Old Limerick Journal. I'm in good company now today. That's all I can say. You know, we're two very important kind of people, you know. Anyway, we'll talk. First of all, Brian, I should have said that you're welcome along to the programme. And we spoke about 3 weeks ago at the launch of the current edition, which is number what, Tom, again? What? Number 45, I think, is it? What's the current one? Number 45. And we spoke about that and at the launch of that a few weeks ago. Brian, first of all, I've read so many things that you've written over the years. And I've heard you. I think I was at about 3 lectures you gave over the years and various subjects. But anyway, well, first of all, the Other Clare, just to explain to people, this is number 45 since 1970, 76, I think was the first one, which only cost 55p was the first one. I remember that when John O'Brien first got involved, you know, but they've gone to 45 already. And this one is a fabulous edition. You know, what article have you in this? What article is in this by you?
The one I put in this year is one on the market houses of County Clare. Market houses I think, have generally been overlooked as a landmark in a whole lot of towns and villages. So I did all the ones in County Clare for this edition of the Other Clare.
Yeah. Because we know in Limerick that there are several markets in Limerick. Now, Limerick being a city, there was the Haymarket, fruit and vegetable market, you know. But the only one I'm familiar now outside of Venice is Tulla. Tulla had one, of course, as well, a big market house in Tulla, which I'm familiar with.
Well, Tulla is unusual in that it's the only town in County Clare with 2 market houses. And they have 2 extant market houses. The first one dates from about 1760, and it wasn't very much used. It was used as a market house and as a courthouse. But in the 1820s, the end of the 1820s, it was sold to the RIC as a barracks. So the Browns, who were the landlords in Tulla, they went and built a second market house in 1843, which is the current one standing. But in fact, the 2 of them are still standing. The market house that was the RIC barracks is also standing now. It's a private residence. And the new market house that was built in 1843 is a public library.
Yeah, because there's a date over the gate going in. Most of them did put had the foresight to put up dates over the entrance, which is a good thing. You know,
yes.
And it gives you a good idea, because there's one in Limerick as well now. Most of them in Limerick had dates over them. But unfortunately, when they go into private ownership at times, you get scrupulous landlords who just decide, what's the point in having the dates of that up there, and they destroy them, which is unfortunate, you know. There's nothing we can do about that. But the market houses, as you said, have been, most of them, I think, are fairly standing, even in County Limerick. The most famous one that I know in County Limerick, I'm sure Tom would agree, is in Kilfinnan, where the head of Staker Wallace was put up over the market house by the Olivers, who were the local landlords, and the tormented poor Staker Wallace, who was a United Irishman, and they were long taking off his head and putting it over the market house in Kilfinnan, which just about survives, you know, but like that. But the articles in the current edition, Tom, there in front of you, is there anything that you caught your eye, Tom, in that?
Yeah, well, first of all, the market house, I was in the one in Six Mile Bridge. My daughter bought furniture at an auction and I went out to collect it. And it's only afterwards, when Brian wrote about the market house in Six Mile Bridge, it's it's a very interesting history on it. Like the other ones that struck me was The Landmore in Clare by Alfred Sexton, because the Landmore is something it's written about nowadays, but it's something that affected the country. You know, it was the big movement towards ownership of land and the tenants' rights. You know, and just tied in with the whole, I suppose, freedom movement and everything. But the fact that people could own their own land, and I enjoyed that one. And then Ed O'Shaughnessy, who was written for the Old Limerick Journal, wrote about the Clare family's exodus to Canada. You know, and then there's a tribute to Lal Quinn. You know, I think John O'Brien wrote that. You know Lal Quinn, Tony.
Oh, both of us know Lal well. Brian, Lal was she was an excellent supporter of the Shannon Archaeological Historical Society. You know, that at least as a tribute, because it's nice to see a tribute to somebody that has died, or as they say now, has passed on. It's a new kind of a thing that has come in lately. Whereas when I was a child, you hear Jimmy died or somebody died, without the saying he passed on. You know, but there are so many articles written. We should tell to people that if people wanted to buy this Other Clare, which again only £10, that it's available. I don't think is it available in Limerick, Tom? Do you know?
O'Mahony's, yeah.
O'Mahony's having it, then, yeah.
And of course the Celtic Bookshop.
Oh, no, I forgot the Celtic Bookshop. Oh, yeah. Pat O'Brien's down in.
Like for 106 pages of history with no ads, it's great value. You know, for €10.
Because they kind of, I know, Brian, over the years, have kind of went for 76, 78 pages normally. You know, most of them have that.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah, well, it's surprising, really, the amount of material that we get. There's no shortage of people willing to contribute articles to our publication, which is the Other Clare. Like there are almost 20 papers in the current edition. Now, like the size of the volume will grow and decrease, as it were, depending on the number of articles. We try to keep it around the 100 or maybe less than 100, but there will be some years you'll get more, and then you try and accommodate as many as you can. Unfortunately, we can't accommodate everybody that contributes because of there has to be a limit to the size of the journal. We try and keep the articles around 5,000-6,000 words. Now we have taken longer ones, but we say 7,000 or 8,000 words would be the maximum type of paper we could accommodate. So, and in that way, we can do up to 20 papers per issue. So,
Tom has that problem too, haven't you, Tom, as regards?
Yeah, well, sometimes if it's very long, we divide it into parts, part 1, part 2, maybe part 3. But, a lot of the time, I get into trouble with people. I try and shorten their articles because, you can take 100 words to say one, like when you could only take, tautology is the word, I think. So, and I'm not, I'm guilty of it myself. Sometimes when I write something myself, I have to go back and say, can I say that shorter, So, but you have to think about the reader as well and maintain their interest, because I know, like with modern technology, Facebook and Google, people have a short interest span. So you need to keep their interest, and you need to have a good opening, So, to get, I'll admit it. The articles I'll read first, I go straight to first that I'm interested in, and then I go back and sometimes I might even read the whole journal, but I pick out the first ones that I'm interested in. And I think everybody's like that. You'll find that it's like eating a box of biscuits at Christmas. You eat the chocolate ones and the nice ones first, and the plain ones left to last. So it's a bit like that.
Yeah.
But
you probably have the same problem as well, have you? As regards what to put in.
Yeah, well, when I get a paper in, I read it through beginning to end. And if there's a lot of what we call surplus material in it that really isn't directly related to the subject, I will say that to the author. and asked him to cut it back. So yeah, we have that problem. I think everybody has that. And then the pictures, we like to have a certain amount of illustrations with the articles, and that usually or generally works. I think it lifts the article, and people who mightn't be that interested in reading every single article, they will look at the pictures and the illustrations, and I think they certainly help it. You can get too many illustrations. I mean, I've had that where, you know, there just are. The illustrations must help the material that's in the article. I mean, I have had, or we have had articles that have had illustrations just for the sake of illustrations. I mean, if they're taking up space and they're not really making a point, there really isn't much, it doesn't make sense to have them. So, somebody said to me recently, being an editor is a thankless job, and it really is sometimes, because your opinion of how the article should be presented and the number of illustrations it should have and so forth. Obviously, the author might have a different point of view and so forth. So it's compromised in the end.
It's a bit like being a referee, you know.
Yeah, referee, it is. If anybody asks me about an article, John one would ask me, and I'd say, I blame Tom Donovan. Tom didn't like it, I'd say, you know, it's kind of heavy way out, you know. It's unfortunate that some people that write articles take umbrage to, you know, they don't understand sometimes that it can't all be put in. And it might be...
Well, one of the problems I get is people writing family histories, and it's of great interest to the family themselves. You know, somebody, like, I've got lots of articles on, we say, the history of the Brown family or whatever. And like, that's very interesting to the Browns, but as a general article for a journal, you know, unless there's something of real interest that the Browns did or whatever the family is, it's not, you know, it's more just for a family, you know, whatever. It's not of general interest.
No, you find that, Brian, all the time, that people, they think that their article, of course, is the best ever, you know, and they get offended. Yeah, unfortunately, you know. Anyway,
it's good to see. It's good to see we're sharing. I see there's at least two contributors here who have contributed to the Old Limerick Journal, Brian Spring and Ed O'Shaughnessy.
Is that right? Yeah, I didn't realise Brian had an article, had articles in the Old Limerick Journal.
Yeah. He had about his Spring ancestors who were jewellers in Limerick, clockmakers, sorry.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, it's good if somebody can do that now, right? On different subjects attributed to a different part of the country. And it's interesting, that's fine, you know. It's just that sometimes you associate people with just writing on one subject, you know, and then when they swing, sometimes you're wondering if they're going to be able to write on something else. You know, if somebody writes on the history of the army in Ireland and you associate him or her with that, then they write an article on some big house, you're wondering, is their article going to be any good? Because they're so used to writing about the army, you know. But Brian, can I just bring up something else while we're talking here? You've written a good bit now, from what I gather over the years, things I've read that you've written on the Inchiquins. There's enough of that. There's so much even you could still write, I'm sure, on the Inchiquins. You know,
Well, I mean, there's no end to material, really. Well, the Inchiquins, they're the Dromoland family, the O'Briens of Inchiquin, and then you had the Earls of Inchiquin. They died out through the early 1800s. But yeah, they both have left a long legacy, and because the record keeping in Dromoland was so good, the Dromoland Castle, there is a whole lot of documentary material and documentary evidence concerning the Inchiquins. Historians can't write if they don't really have documentation. It's like the old slaves in Israel or in Egypt. You know, they couldn't make bricks if they hadn't straw. A historian won't be able to write material if he hasn't got documents. So essentially, although you shouldn't be totally dependent on documents. I mean, archaeology has a tremendous contribution to make to historical research. So old buildings, cut stoneworks, all kinds of field monuments. All those artifacts will help. Like in Ennis there this year now, we printed a banknote that turned up from the early 19th century. I think it was 1810. And I mean, that gives you, there was very little silver or coinage in circulation at the time of the wars with Napoleon. So there was a resort to printing money. And a whole lot of merchants, I'm sure in the whole of Munster, but in Ireland generally, printed their own notes. You could print them up to, well, the largest denomination I have seen is €1 guinea. But I've seen ones as small as 1 shilling and 7.5 pennies. And you say, well, why would anybody print a money note for 1 shilling, 7.5 pennies? Well, you see, they were trying to discourage people from cashing them in. The chap who printed those notes, he'd only cash them in for you. He'd give you coins for them if you had enough of them to the value of 1 guinea. And I think there were 14, you'd need 14 of his notes of 1 shilling, 7.5 pence to make up a guinea. So you needed 14 of his notes before you could actually cash it. Plus to make them harder to cash. But it just gives you an insight into the way money was transacted and what was happening in the early 19th century. Very little coinage circulated, which really is
was that note for a trader in Ennis? That note you found?
Well, that was done by a man called Foster Parsons. He was a printer in Ennis, so he could print his own money, and he would circulate those. And he was allowed to. There was an act brought in the early 1900s because of the Napoleonic Wars, and there was a shortage of coinage, that traders in good standing could print their own notes. But of course, there were all kinds of devious people involved, and the bankruptcies were not uncommon. But it's just the one that we published for Ennis this year. It belonged to a man called John O'Donnell, and John was the town clerk of Ennis. And he also ran a bank as a sideline. So naturally, or almost inevitably, people like that did eventually go bankrupt. So if you were left holding some of his notes, well, you lost your money.
Yeah. In the early 1800s, newspapers were littered with cases of people being caught making base coin or false coin,
Yes.
There was a lot, and a man came to me during the week, and he found an old invoice from the early 1800s, and there was a letter in it saying, "I enclose half note and stamps." So, like the thing at the time was, you didn't send the full note through the post; you cut it in half, and you sent a half through the post. And you gave the odd pence then in stamps to cover it. And then when you got the goods, you send on the other half note to cover pilferage or robbing in the post,
Right, okay.
There's a lovely book written by, it was written actually as a thesis by Other Clare, Tom, you're familiar with that book, on the bankers of Munster. A lovely book. But he mainly covers Charleville and places, but about Monsell's Bank, which was about the biggest in Limerick, and you had Furnell's Bank, you had Bruce's Bank, and it explains in that about the notes and about people losing money. Some of the banks then paid out everything, they paid the people what was in, which caused an awful rush. All it needed was a rumour to start that the bank was in trouble, and everybody ran to the bank looking for their money back, straight away with their bills to cash them in. But that did happen a lot, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, when the whole thing collapsed, really, I suppose, the whole thing. But anyway, we're enough about talking about banks. But I hadn't heard of him, O'Donnell, now. I hadn't heard of him at all.
Yeah, well, that would be a very small bank. Just to tell you, O'Connell made use of banks. Daniel O'Connell, he set up the National Bank. It was the time the Catholic Church had started to build their new churches around the coming of emancipation. or Catholic emancipation. But O'Connell used to do that, or rather some of his supporters, he'd create a false rush on a bank. So essentially, if there was the provincial bank at the time was regarded as a Protestant bank and certainly an enemy of the National Bank, which was the Catholic bank. Yeah. So what you did was you collected up, you went into a town like Charleville or Limerick or Tralee or Ennis, something like that. You collected O'Connell supporters, any of them with money belonging, with notes belonging to the provincial bank, was all collected up, and then they'd all go, descend on the bank together, demand the cashing of the notes. So there'd be a run on the provincial bank, and they'd have to close. So to avert that, the bankers resorted to a coach and 4 horses that would carry gold sovereign, a box of sovereigns, a chest rather of them, and that would be sited somewhere in central Munster. So if there was a run in a bank in Tralee, they'd get the coach out there as fast as they could to cover the paper money that was being cashed. But it was a sort of a political tactic that O'Connell and his supporters used. But that all eventually came to an end about 1835 to 40, when there was new legislation and banks were set up in a more secure system. So but it's interesting.
In Limerick, we still have a bank place where Mansell's Bank was situated. It became the centre of commerce. Well, right opposite the Hunt Museum, which is Bank Place. And luckily, it has maintained its name as Bank Place. But like that, the banks were, you forget that, like the banks. And then, of course, the Tuas were the boys for the Bank of Ireland. They're the Tuas family up in Wicklow. They were the boys for the Bank of Ireland. There's a fine book written actually on that, on the setting up of the Bank of Ireland by the Tuas family. Anyway, but we've enough said banks. Listen, I want to ask you about this book, Brian. Sorry, Tom.
Oh no, I was just saying that I came across a great story about Daniel O'Connell there, just when Brian mentioned him. A farmer sold cattle at a fair, and it must bring in, this is in the folklore about Daniel O'Connell. He sold cattle at a fair and he made £80. And on the way home, he called into a pub to have a few drinks, and there was a few ne'er-do-wells in the pub. So he asked the publican, would he mind his money until the next day? And he came back next day and the publican said, "You're drunk, you give me no money, you know." So he went to Daniel O'Connell and Daniel said to him, "Can you raise another 80? And Daniel said, "Yeah." He said, "Get another 80 and go in with your neighbour and give him the 80 pounds. So he did that. And he said, "No, go back down without anybody, ask him for the money." And he came back with his £80. He said to Daniel O'Connell, "But I'm still £80 down." He said, "No, get your neighbour," he said, "and go in and ask for the £80. So he caught him out, like, you know, he double bluffed him, you know. So when Brian was saying about Daniel O'Connell having experience.
Work now with cameras inside the place, it probably wouldn't work now, you know, that's the only thing. But Brian, I want to mention to you, which I mentioned to you before, one of the, well, if you don't mind me saying this, the best thing you've ever written was a book called The Stranger's Gaze, Travels in County Clare, 1534 to 1950. And well, what I like about it is I love travellers, what people thought of Ireland, of Limerick especially, or anywhere in the whole country, what they thought. And you wrote this about County Clare, and before you answer, I tell you, it's a pity this is not done for Limerick, which is a shame that it was never done for Limerick. But this is, just to explain first of all, Brian, what it is and how you got the idea for this book.
Well, traveller accounts are I've always regarded them as very valuable when you're doing historical research, because you've got a person coming into an area, a stranger, and they can bring a fresh eye with them. You know, they haven't seen the area before. They have a different view of the place, and that can be very valuable. And also they give you sort of general descriptions that people living in the town or the city or the parish would never think of giving you. So they're quite valuable from that point of view. So, you know, you might have a visitor to a town or a city in the 1750s, and then you'd have another visitor to the same town in the 1850s, and even to compare and contrast the two viewpoints from a historical point of view, it can be very interesting. So what I did, I had a number of these collected for County Clare, and they were quite hard to collect, because what would happen is people touring Ireland, they would leave Dublin, they might go to Cork and then up to Limerick, but they'd bypass Clare. If they were coming, let's say, from Dublin to Limerick, they have a big description on Limerick, and then they'd be heading for the Lakes of Killarney. And you'd never, I was the same. The other great tourist spot at the time was the Giant's Causeway. You know, they'd be heading north. They'd never come around the west of Ireland at all. With the great boom, the golden age of travel literature really is the 1830s. They started then. And that's because of the railway situation, the setting up of the railways in England. And people could travel easier. And the coaches were going in Ireland in the 1830s, and gradually 1840s, 1850s, the railways came in Ireland. And as the railways spread, the literature, the travel literature improved quite a bit. So, for example, in the 18th century, in the 1700s, you'll have to do a lot of searching to get a traveller that travelled the west of Ireland, whereas in the 19th century, of course, it is much, much easier. So what I did was I took a selection of those, I think 50 or 60 accounts of County Clare, starting in the 1500s and moving. That man, Edmund Sexton, a great Limerick man, he left a nice description of Limerick, but also along the Shannon estuary of Clare, the northern shore of the estuary from the 1530s, which is quite interesting, and a description of Scattery Island from the 1530s, which, you know, from a historical point of view, of course, is very, very valuable. So when I was doing that book, I regarded it to some extent as a source book, where anybody who was going to do write a paper for the Other Clare, for example, or write a paper on anything, that they would dip into this book, or could dip in if they wanted to, and they'd find maybe some material in it that they could use. So I had that in mind also. So the best of the travel descriptions of County Clare that I could find up to about 1950, and that was it. Yeah, that's what.
Let me count.
Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, sorry. No, Limerick County suffered the same as Clare, in the sense that a lot of travel writers came to Killarney, came up through County Kerry, got a boat in Tower, and came straight to Limerick. So they dodged Limerick County, or avoided. Like Arthur Young is an example. He left Tarbert, and so even Mary Jane Knott, she has a very good description of, I think it's 1836. She goes down to Shannon and she gives descriptions of all the houses along, you know, the estuary at the time, things like that. So, you know, one thing was, and what I love about your book, Brian, is the introductions, you know, the background to who the author is, because that's important, because a lot of them brought their prejudices with them, you know, don't you agree?
That's correct. Yeah.
I mean, I'd recommend this. I actually, just looking at the entrance, this is signed, not by you. This is signed, Tony. You'll get great use of this. Sean Spellacy. Spellacy gave me this. I didn't spot that till now, you know, on the inside. But where did you find all these references?
Well, sure, there you are. Like, I had a misspent youth, you know, when everybody else was, I don't know what they were doing. They were at cider parties or smoking pot or whatever. Here was I in the library still on these things.
Yeah. It's not too bad.
I just found, I would say maybe over a 10-year period. Not that if I found them, I set them aside. And when, you know, and gradually, they built up. But you know, I didn't overdo it. I mean, if I found an odd one here, there, every other month or year, I'd find a couple of more, and I just left them aside. And then they were looking for a book to publish in the Clare Library. They had set up the Clasp Press, and they were actually looking for people, publications, material they could publish. And I suggested to Maureen Comer at the time that when she asked me, I said, you know, I have a collection of travel descriptions of County Clare that I've sort of set aside there. You know, I'll be working on it off and on over the years. And she said, sure, that'd be perfect. And there you go. It wasn't something I really planned. I sat down one night, I said, this is what I'm going to do. It sort of evolved a bit, yeah.
There are certain writers in it now that I was very curious about. For example, obviously the first one I can see here now, the war in Clare, Edmund Ludlow. I mean, I'm interested in Cromwell and the army. And Ludlow, of course, is the man that said, what was it? There wasn't 3 water to drown a man, 3 to hang him, or to bury him, which is always attributed to Cromwell, but we know it was Ludlow was the man that went through Connacht really into County Clare, and what he thought of the whole situation at the time. And you have so many, well, and then of course the Penns, William Penn, the man that was associated with Bunratty. And then
that's correct, yes.
There's 2 Williams, there's a father and son, and the son then was the fellow that went off to Pennsylvania. When he scooted away to Pennsylvania, the founder of the state, whereas the father was a dreadful, dreadful man as well. He was the man that went to the West Indies, and he went off working, of course, for Cromwell at the beginning, and went off to the West Indies, off looking for land and looking for properties in the West Indies, places like Santo Domingo, and the Spaniards, of course, had been there before him. You know, but they thought by sending Penn, and I can't think of the fellow that went with him now on the ship. And Penn was very annoyed. He wasn't made master of the expedition that went there. He was only second in command. But anyway, that's a story for another day. But it's great to read. And what I like about this is the articles aren't very long. It gives you just a few pages on what they thought of each. You know, it's fascinating.
Yes, yeah. Well, you see, I think I was very sort of precise on the material I wanted. You know, you get writers, and they'll give you all kinds of information and things they think about and what the Irish history was or wasn't. You know, I cut out that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
What I was looking for was observation and things that these people had experienced themselves while they were here. You know, so you get a lot of surplus or superfluous material that really you can't use, or you know. So I did that. I cut it down to what I felt was people generally would be interested in, and also very much material that you could use if you were doing some research. And then I think, as you said there, Tony, the introduction to each piece. So who was the writer, if it was a man or a woman, where they came from, the profession they had, what was their interest. You need that to give the thing a bit of context. You know, otherwise you're reading kind of a blank sheet. You don't know anything about the background, or, you know, so you do need to give each piece, not too much, but you do need to give it a little bit of context so that the person reading it, you know, can pick up on it. And therefore I did a little introduction on the author in each case. Yeah.
Have you found it interesting, Tom, as well, as regards this book? Isn't it a pity?
I was always interested in reading things because there was a book. I got a book by John McVeigh, it was done by Woodford Press, Irish travel writing, and then there was a one by C.J. Woods, travelers accounts as source material for Irish. It really just lists the. So I think the fact that Brain did the book before Google, or before the advent of Google, meant he had to spend some time in the library. And sometimes I think, like Brian, we spent lots of time gathering, copying material in libraries, and now it's all scanned up online, you know. So yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. It's much easier to do it today with
Yeah,
the internet.
but sometimes it's like the late Chris O'Mahony said to me one time about genealogy. I said to him, you know, I don't believe in, you know, I like to do the work myself and find it, you know, rather than being handed it to me, you know. And he was defending his genealogy service. He said, well, some people like to buy a fish in a fishmongers as well, you know. He said they don't have to go fishing. So, but there is a thrill in the pursuit, you know, rather than you know, they say about love.
Well,
the
yeah,
thrill is
yeah.
in the pursuit, not the acquisition. And sometimes in history, there is a thrill in the pursuit, you know, rumbling through pages and pages of stuff to find the odd nugget, you know.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, Tom. I think that is, yeah, the pursuit is very often the most interesting, because you never know what you're going to find and run up against. Yeah. No, I agree. For what motivates a historian, you know, they find that little nugget at the after end of a day's searching, and it's enough to keep them going for another day. That's
it's like penning for gold, you know. You mightn't find many nuggets, but the thought of finding a nugget keeps you going, you know.
Could be lucky, you know. But I mean, there's another thing. Yeah, I mentioned you there before we started. I often pick up the Limerick Journal or the Other Clare, and you find an article that you haven't read properly, or you've skimmed over, you know, which happens all the time. Because I shouldn't say this, but I skip over a fair bit of archaeology, you know. I can only take so much of that, you know. I like to find. I remember I criticised the North Munster Journal years ago. Did a good professor in, and he didn't like it when I said there's 14 pages on 16 ways to look at an arrowhead, you know. And I find it very boring, you know. There's only so much you can say about an arrowhead. But anyway, I haven't said that. But there's an article that not about the article, just the subject in general. You wrote an article here about I have it here in front of me, the operation of the anti-popery laws against Catholic property. Now, what in Clare was, as before you start, just to say, Clare was really always associated with Connacht before we kind
That's right.
So was or were the popery laws, where they, what way would I put it to you? Clare was a kind of a poor county. So would there have been much agitation in popery laws in Clare, if you can get my drift?
Yeah, well, how would I start that? There was very little ground in County Clare that was owned by papists, or what we would call Catholics now, under the popery laws. In other words, essentially Catholics couldn't own property. And if what was described as a British Protestant, sorry, one moment. Beg your pardon. If a Protestant made a claim on a property, first of all, a Protestant making a claim on a property, essentially what would happen, if, for example, one of the anti-popery laws was a Catholic could not lease a property longer than 31 years. That was the maximum lease that was open to a Catholic. Now, if particularly attorneys were very good at this, they would have a good idea, let's say in Limerick City, if there was a Catholic in the city who held property, they'd have a pretty good idea whether it was for 31 years or longer. So they would identify fairly quickly the number of Catholic properties that were vulnerable. And of course, if a Protestant made a claim on a Catholic property and proved it, he would then own the property himself. So there was every incentive to make these claims. Now, on that article you're talking about, that's quite interesting. The man making the claim on the property, he didn't have to give his name on the paperwork. So these these kind of papers, they don't turn up in public collections. They're always in private collections. They were not, you're not going to find them in the public record office. And the two that I published there in the Other Clare, this was going back a good few years ago now, there was a solicitor's office in Baggot Street in Dublin, that a very old one, and they had a lot of old material. They offered the collection to the National Library, who turned it down because they didn't have the resources to accept it. And the same happened with the National Archives. So eventually the owners of the property, in desperation, they hired a fellow with a truck, and they carried the whole lot of the paperwork out to a dump in Kildare, and the whole of the solicitor's office, the paperwork going back over so many hundred years, it was dumped. Now, it became known that there was papers in the Kildare municipal dump, and a couple of guys went down there, and there were stamp collectors. They were really into letters with stamps on them, or envelopes with stamps on them.
Yeah.
But anyway, make long story short, this guy that I met, he had got two documents from the Kildare dump. What they were two Protestant people who lived in Ennis in the 1730s and 40s, who had made claims on Catholic properties, and very valuable documents. So I bought them off him, and they've since been donated to the National Library. And it was those two documents that I used for that article, because you won't find those kind of documents in, as I say, public collections.
But isn't it? It's a terrible reflection on our National Archives, National Library, that they wouldn't just put it in a storehouse until such time as they got resources. Like we had the same. Tony and I and a number of others had rescued a solicitor's office papers as well, and they were being dumped. We took them out of a skip, and tried to recycle them. Now, a lot of the material in it wouldn't be of any interest, but you would pick out the material quite easily. Now you would have to have gloves, and because the dust. We were wearing masks before it was mandatory, back then. But you remember that, Tony, at the time we had to move around from place to place because people got sick of storing it.
Because we stored them in one place, and this man said he couldn't get into his room. Then we moved them to another place, and finally we'd go down. I still have some of those at home, actually, by the way. But they're interesting. I can identify a lot of the people now mentioned in these documents that had businesses in Limerick, and it's amazing, like the chairs. There was one book now of people that had involvement in various companies going back to the 1900s. It's amazing what you'll find. And sometimes
even all billheads, the amount of information on billheads, where people traded and what they sold, and it was, but it's a pity. Like when you think about, there's probably like those two you bought, Brian. Like there's probably some for every county in Ireland. If you. Yes.
Yeah. Well, you see, I don't know how many documents like that you get in solicitors' office, but solicitors' offices can be very valuable places to find documentation.
Yeah.
And and they are certainly worth saving and conserving. It's a pity that there isn't some service, around that can rescue that kind of documentation. I think it is. Well, I know in County Clare it is getting better. They have started set up a local archive now, and they have it's called a machine shed, but they have a building where they can store the documents. And that is a huge improvement. But like that, you get a lot of surplus documentation that really wouldn't.
Useless.
Yes. So it needs somebody to through material, and pick out the valuable stuff that I'm sure in every solicitor's office, I don't know, 10-20% of it would need to be conserved, and the rest could let go. It wouldn't really require that.
Well, I was fascinated by the popery laws. Really, was that they're really out to destroy the country, to destroy the Catholic faith, education in the country, and the Catholics, we call them of Ireland, were really downtrodden. I mean, they were really draconian, the laws. How did they manage to get away with it?
Well, like that's the penal law period, Tony. I mean, that's it's a dark period in our history. But the thing is too that as the century wore on, the 18th century wore on, you had these what were called friendly Protestants. You could sign your property over to a friendly Protestant, and therefore avoid some of the legislation. And that did happen. And then, of course, you have some cases, not too many, but I certainly know one in County Clare, where in the 19th century, of course, who actually owned the property then? Was it the original owners or the people who were holding the deeds? You get a few of those cases. But by and large, using a Protestant as a sort of a foil against the anti-popery laws generally worked. You know.
You wouldn't want to fall out into.
Oh, no.
No. It's a bit like modern marriage. You want to make sure we.
Yeah, but was there any case, I wonder, Brian, of where you mentioned there of signing it over to a friendly Protestant, right? Was there many cases of this Protestant actually claiming the property?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Sometimes you do come across the odd case in the 19th century where there is a case as to who actually has title on the property, but not too many. I think in most cases you will find that it actually, like those two cases in Ennis, in fact, the properties, although they were threatened with confiscation, both of them escaped. They were not actually confiscated. So, they were able to use different laws and different ways of protecting property. Essentially was to keep it as quiet and as secret as you possibly could. If you were a Catholic and you had property, you didn't advertise it. So that was how it was done.
Well, it's a period in history that really there wasn't much, well, when I say it's spoken of really, we heard of the popery laws, but you just said, so what, but they're really draconian when you think about it. What they tried, I mean, we're all familiar with the case of what's your man down in Cork,
Artillery, yes.
All over his horse really started. He had a horse valued at over £5. The local landlord did. He maintained that. And he did this thing against him anyway, because he kind of came back to Ireland and kind of flaunting his authority, not his authority, but he had made money seemingly on the continent, came back and had this horse worth over £5, which brought a lot of agitation to the local landlord, who was out to get him really as such, and did get him in the end, all over having this horse worth over £5. It's unbelievable that you couldn't.
There's lots of stories. There's a priest buried in Knockpatrick back near Foynes, Philip O'Neill. His name is in Irish, and he was killed for two soldiers tried to take the horse off him because, being a Catholic priest, he used it for going from house to house doing sick calls. But the local landlord, Spring Rise or the United Glen, didn't enforce it. But these two traveling soldiers, decided to take the horse from him, and he resisted, and they killed him. And they got away with it because he wasn't entitled to have the horse, so they were entitled to take it from him, even if it meant killing him. So, and in the United Glens estate, there was two, I can't think of their names now, it's not pretenders, there's a name for people who took land from Catholics. They made claims. There was a name for them, but there was two who made a claim. Pardon? Sorry?
Yeah, there is, because I can't think of the word either. There is a word that took the land. Yeah,
discoverers.
Yeah, that's the word. And but like in your case, Brian, they failed. They tried to claim it, but through some technicality, they failed. But so it was around the country,
But the question of the £5 horse, I think, is quite interesting. The whole idea about that was Catholics weren't supposed to have status You know, it's like the difference between driving around in a Mercedes Benz and driving around in a Lada.
Yeah.
You know, if you could, if you were riding a horse worth more than £5, you had status. After all, an Anglo-Irish person was described as a Protestant on a horse.
Yeah.
So a person on a horse had status. And of course, if it was a good-looking horse and so forth, it had more status.
Yeah.
And the case of Art O'Leary in Cork is a very good one. The idea was to take the horse from him and make him walk, because pedestrians didn't have the status of, obviously, people who could afford to ride around in a horse. So it was a question of, it was like keeping poor people, Catholic people, in their place.
But it wasn't just Catholics, Quakers and other religions suffered as well.
Yes, they were indeed, but not to the same extent as the Catholic population. The laws against popery, as it was called, were far more draconian than the ones that applied to dissenters.
Yeah.
Protestant dissenters.
It was really a dreadful time. But as you said, roughly about 1770, then they were relaxed. But then I think, being the devil's advocate again, I think then were the Protestants, did they need the Catholics at that stage? Were they getting thin on the ground? You know, I just wondered that they kind of backed off a little bit from the laws, because they still were there. But was it a case of the Catholics are getting too powerful? You know, we have to stay with them, you know. You wonder.
But you see, there was the question, Tony, of enforcement of laws. Any number of laws could be passed, but it was another question to have the manpower to enforce them. And, you know, as the 18th century wore on, they weren't enforced only in extremis, only in particular cases where they were trying to make a point. But they could be enforced if push came to shove. But they were on the statute book, and they could be reactivated. So it was. You have to remember that you had a minority ruling a majority population. So the minority always felt threatened and under siege.
Even I was told of several families, but I know one family now in West Limerick. To this day, all the people will tell you, I'll tell you how they got in there. Their grandfather was an emergency man, and they came in onto land that they didn't own, you know. And also there's a reference to Lenehan has a reference to John Cusick, with the Cusick would say in Limerick. But anyway, about land in Kilkishen, I think it is.
There is a famous case there. You are right. Yes.
Yeah, I've only read that now in Lenehan, where he mentions Cusick. There's something. Was it Stoddard? Did Stoddard get the land? There's something anyway about land.
No, again, what Tom was saying there, Cusick was one of these discoverers. Yeah. He would search around East Clare mainly for Catholic families who were vulnerable, whose titles were vulnerable, or who may have had a flaw as regards the penal laws. And of course, he would target them. And of course, you'd never know who was targeting your property, because the first thing that happened was the person who was after your property, he would set up a straw man. He'd hire another man of low social standing to operate on his behalf, on understanding that if the case was successful, the property would come back to the Protestant. But so you always had a front man, and those documents that you find in solicitor's office that I found, or that I purchased, that was the case there, where these straw men had been employed to act as frontmen for the real individuals, two attorneys as it happened, who were trying to get their hands on vulnerable property. But so it took a long time for the people in East Clare to discover that it was Cusick and Kilkishen that was behind all of these discoveries. And I forget what his epitaph is on his tomb, on his gravestone now, but it's pretty damning.
It is, Lenehan quotes it actually. I can't remember it now, but Lenehan does quote it. It's funny that they don't about being a discoverer of something and something, you know. Right?
Yeah. Apparently, they couldn't work out who was trying to get their hands on all this property, and it was eventually, after a number of years, traced back to Cusick. But it is written on his tombstone anyway. Yeah, that's a famous case.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I'm glad you know about him now, because I've only read what Lenihan says about that. I never had to read anyone else, only from Lenihan's history. And he quotes it. And I don't know why he even mentions Kilkishen now, because Lenihan was mainly Limerick, and there must be some.
I think he might have had the papers. But of course, Lenihan has a lot of Clare material. I've got some very valuable Clare material out of Lenihan's history. It's a wonderful, and another source for people who are doing historical research is his paper. Was it the Limerick Reporter? What paper did Lenihan?
It's very Vindicator.
Vindicator, yeah.
Was it? Yeah. Well, it is very, very valuable paper because he he obviously had a great interest in history, so he often treats of historical matter. And I have found, like, I was doing a paper there on Eugene O'Curry, the professor of Irish in UCD, or in the Catholic University of Ireland, and I came across one of Lenihan's articles in his newspaper, where he has a heading, "A Night with Eugene O'Curry." Excuse me, and it's a wonderful piece of journalism and a great insight into O'Curry. So
Mention O'Curry, Brian. The late Mannix Joyce told me he was going through the newspapers and he came across. It was in a Clare paper anyway, where there was a correction made. And somebody had written, and it wasn't you, somebody had written a story about O'Curry and said that his family were evicted from a farm in West Clare for being rapists. And the following week they said, we'd like to correct our previous, said, it should have read papists.
Very good. Very good.
So just you were talking about papists there and Eugene O'Curry.
Yes.
But, Lenihan's newspapers, they gave the Catholic perspective as well. Sometimes it was like unpublished. There was totally one-sided version. But at the same time, it was a counterbalance to the establishment papers like the Limerick Chronicle, that gave the total Protestant version of events. So I think if you read both the Limerick Reporter and the Chronicle, you get a kind of a middle ground, a balance, Yeah.
Which reminds me, Ben, talking of Clare histories, and kind of a stupid question in one sense now, but who would you find? Would it be O'Dwyer's history, Frost, or what would you kind of go to for Clare? Who kind of covers the best? Yeah. Would it be O'Dwyer, Frost, or who?
Well, the three 19th century histories of Clare are James Frost, James White, and Philip Dwyer. Yeah. Dwyer did a history of the diocese of Killaloe. Well, I think James Frost's history is, for me, is better than is the best of the three of those. But I mean, it's not for Frost's history. For a person like me, I find it very interesting because he had access to the public records in Dublin before it was burnt down in 1922. So Frost had spent a lot of time in the public record office, and consequently he has copied a lot of documents that now are no longer extant or can be got. So his history is particularly valuable because of that. But for a person who's generally interested in history but doesn't want to read the documentation, it mightn't suit a person like that. It's more for a person who's into searching out, researching particular people, particular localities. If you were to criticize Frost, you would say he put documentation in his book without sufficient commentary. You can let the documentation dominate your publication. You really do need to have a commentary on it, and what it can tell you, what you think it is telling you, and the relevance of it and that. And if you were to criticize Frost, you would say that there is too much documentation without proper notation, if you know what I mean. But
Yeah.
so it mightn't. But apart from that, it is now. If you like, then just a general description with not too much documentation, I would suggest White. But White didn't. White didn't hide his political viewpoints or anything, and he's quite direct, very Catholic, very anti. You could say almost he's sectarian, and so that's now. And if you want a different viewpoint, then you go to Philip Dwyer. He was a Protestant minister, so he gives you very much the other side of the story.
Yeah,
If that's what you want, if that's what you want.
Yeah.
Because
Anyway,
the 3-volume history of the Diocese of Killaloe by Ignatius Murphy is very good as well.
Excellent, yes.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying 19th century history.
Oh, yeah.
But the 20th century, Ignatius Murphy did a wonderful job in his 3 volumes. And the point is, he brought the history of the Diocese of Killaloe up to date, up into the 20th century.
Had done it before that, but I find it very readable as well. It's
yeah. Gleason did a marvelous job as well, but he only brought it up to about 1500, to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah.
So
that was volume 1. Supposed to be more volumes, but it never happened. Unfortunately, it was Steiger's volume 1, Gleason's. And of course, that never happened after that, unfortunately. Anyway, come here. We're coming up to time. We're already talking an hour. First of all, when we started off talking, I should tell people number 45 of the Other Clare is available for €10. It's available down at Pat O'Brien's bookshop in Limerick if anybody's interested in getting it, because it is worth reading, really. I suppose if you're interested in local history, you'll always find one article in the journal that you're more interested in the rest of them, probably. You'll always find something with a mix of articles that are there. And also, The Stranger's Gate is a book, which is, God, when was this written? It's in the 90s, I think, sometime.
I think so. It's 1990 something, yeah.
98, I've written myself on this, 1998. Brian, can myself and Tom Donovan, on behalf of the Limerick Historical Society, I shouldn't be saying that now, the Limerick Historical Society, to men from Clare, can we thank you for coming on today? And it's been a pleasure having you on. And I suppose, like minds, when people, sometimes when you're talking, Tom feels this as well, people get bored of history sometimes, don't tell me that. But when you're talking to somebody that follows you and you can follow them, when they know what you're talking about.
We're on the same wavelength.
Yeah. And oh God, it's great for me. It's like going to a lecture. You go to a lecture of a society, any society, and when it's over, you meet 2 people afterwards that you can dissect the lecture with. And I'm interested in that, Some fellow says, whereas the crowd have gone home, basically, and you're left there with these 2 people, and you'd say, what do you think of that, John? Well, I wouldn't agree with what he said there now, wouldn't you? Why? And you get a different perspective on it, and it makes it's great to be corrected, I think, anyway. I like being corrected, because none of us know it all, although I've been accused of knowing it all, but none of us know it all. And it's great to meet somebody that, as you said, on the same wavelength, Anyway, Brian, can we thank you for coming on today?
You can indeed, Tony, and it's been my pleasure, I assure you.
I'm sure Tom enjoyed it as well,
I did, yeah.
And thank you, Tom, as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay,
we'll see you at next year's launch, Brian.
Please God.
Okay, good luck to you.
Okay, and thank you very much again. Bye.